At the dawn of the 20th century, Tulsa, Oklahoma was still a rough frontier town. Dusty streets, wooden sidewalks, and oil derricks rising against a burning sky. It was a place built on dreams and desperation, where fortunes were made overnight and lost by sunrise. But just north of the railroad tracks, separated by law and prejudice, something extraordinary was happening. That neighborhood was Greenwood, an African-American district born out of segregation, yet bursting with ambition, pride and possibility. The people who built Greenwood were descendants of freedmen, sharecroppers, and pioneers who came west after the Civil War. They came because Oklahoma offered something the Deep South never had: land, autonomy, and hope. Some were the children of those who had lived on black towns across Oklahoma Territory, where African Americans could govern themselves. They brought with them the same spirit of resilience. By 1906, a visionary black landowner named O.W. Gurley purchased 40 acres of land in Tulsa and declared it a place where black Americans could thrive, free from daily humiliation. He built a boarding house, opened stores, and began selling lots to other black settlers. Soon, Greenwood grew into a self-contained city within a city. By 1921, Greenwood Avenue was a bustling boulevard lined with 2- and 3-story brick buildings. The sidewalks were crowded with businessmen, teachers, and ministers in tailored suits. Horse-drawn carriages gave way to automobiles owned by doctors and lawyers. Children walked to school with books in hand, past the aroma of fresh bread from black-owned bakeries and the rhythm of jazz spilling out of cafes. There were more than 600 businesses, grocery stores, tailors, cafes, law offices, and medical clinics. The Stratford Hotel, built by J.B. Stratford, had 54 luxurious rooms, a dining hall, and a pool hall, one of the finest hotels in all of Oklahoma, black or white. There was the Dreamland Theater, where locals gathered to watch silent films and live performances. Greenwood had its own newspapers, such as the Tulsa Star, which celebrated community success and encouraged civic activism. The money circulating in Greenwood's economy was remarkable. According to some estimates, $1 would change hands, nearly 19 times before leaving the community. In an era when most African Americans in the South lived under the crushing weight of Jim Crow laws, Greenwood stood as proof of what black enterprise could achieve when given a chance. But prosperity drew attention and resentment. White Tulsa, just across the railroad tracks, looked upon Greenwood with a mix of fascination and hostility. Segregation laws made sure the two communities rarely mixed socially, but economically they were interdependent. Many white-owned businesses relied on black labor, yet the idea of black wealth, of black excellence existing independently, struck fear and envy into the hearts of many white residents. Racial tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Ku Klux Klan was expanding rapidly in Oklahoma after World War I, feeding off post-war anxiety and racial hatred. White newspapers often portrayed Greenwood residents as arrogant or dangerous, accusing them of forgetting their place. Still, Greenwood continued to shine. On a Saturday night, Greenwood Avenue glowed with electric light, one of the few places in Tulsa where people of color could dine, dance, and live freely. Jazz musicians played from open windows, barbers joked with customers, and families gathered in churches that echoed with gospel hymns and sermons of hope. It was a self-sustaining, culturally rich world, but also a fragile one. Its very success made it a target. Tulsa was a city divided not only by race, but by fear of change, fear of equality, fear of losing control. In the spring of 1921, those fears would erupt. A single rumor, born in an elevator, twisted by prejudice and amplified by a hungry press, would ignite one of the deadliest acts of racial violence in American history. But before that moment, there was Greenwood, proud, thriving, full of laughter, ambition, and dreams. A place where people truly believed that hard work could overcome hate. This was Black Wall Street, not just a neighborhood, but a vision of what America could have been. And like all great dreams, it was destined to be tested by fire. It was the morning of May 30th, 1921. The air in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was thick with heat and tension. The Great War had ended only a few years before, but the city was still restless, divided by color lines as sharp as barbed wire. White veterans came home to few jobs, while the Ku Klux Klan was spreading across the Midwest like wildfire. All it took was a whisper to ignite chaos. That whisper began in an elevator. A young black man named Dick Rowland, just 19 years old, worked shining shoes downtown. He was polite, ambitious, and known to keep to himself. Because segregation barred him from using most public restrooms, he had permission to use a colored facility on the top floor of the Drexel building. To get there, he had to take the elevator operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. No one knows exactly what happened when the elevator doors closed that morning. Some said Dick tripped as he stepped inside and instinctively reached out to steady himself, brushing Sarah's arm. She screamed, startled. Others claimed there was more, but there were no witnesses, no evidence, only noise, panic, and prejudice. When the elevator reached the ground floor, a white clerk rushed to call the police, shouting that a black man had attacked a white girl. By that afternoon, Rowland was arrested. Sarah Page refused to press charges, telling investigators later that nothing had happened, but the damage was done. The story spread through Tulsa's white community like oil catching fire. The next morning, the Tulsa Tribune published an article under the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." Inside, an editorial, later, mysteriously torn from the archives, reportedly called for a lynching. By dusk, hundreds of white men were gathering outside the courthouse where Rowland was being held. They were armed with rifles, pistols, and anger. Lynching was not a threat in 1921 America. It was a tradition. Crowds had hung, burned, and mutilated thousands of black men across the South, often cheered on by spectators. And now Tulsa was on the brink of adding another name to that gruesome list. Word of the mob reached Greenwood quickly. The residents knew what came next. They had seen it too many times before. But Greenwood was different. Many of its men were World War I veterans, disciplined, proud, and unwilling to watch another innocent man die. Around 25 of them, armed and resolute, drove to the courthouse to offer protection. They spoke with Sheriff Willard McCullough, who assured them Rowland would be safe. The men left, but the mob kept growing. By 10 p.m., more than 1,000 white men crowded the courthouse steps, restless and loud. Rumors spread that the mob planned to storm the jail. So, a second group of 75 armed black men returned from Greenwood, determined to protect Rowland. They arrived just before midnight. As they approached, jeers erupted from the crowd. Someone shouted, "What are you going to do with those guns?" A white man lunged for one of the rifles. There was a struggle, a hand on metal, a flash of movement, and then a single shot split the night. That gunshot was the sound of Tulsa breaking. In an instant, the courthouse square exploded with gunfire. Bullets ripped through the air. When the smoke cleared, several men lay bleeding on the pavement. The black defenders retreated toward Greenwood, firing as they went. The white mob, furious and humiliated, regrouped and began to arm themselves for war. They raided pawn shops, hardware stores, even the National Guard armory, taking every weapon they could find. By the early hours of May 31st, thousands of armed white men were gathering on the south side of the tracks. They weren't coming just for Dick Rowland anymore. They were coming to destroy an entire community that had dared to succeed. In Greenwood, families packed hurriedly, clutching children, Bibles and photographs. Shopkeepers locked their doors, though they knew locks would not stop what was coming. The glow of downtown Tulsa flickered in the distance as gunfire echoed through the streets. No one in Greenwood could imagine how quickly their world would vanish. Within hours, the pride of Black Wall Street would become smoke rising into the morning sky. The night bled into morning, and the city of Tulsa stood on the edge of madness. The single gunshot outside the courthouse had broken something deep in the heart of the city, unleashing a fury that could no longer be contained. By dawn on May 31, 1921, the quiet streets of Greenwood were bracing for a storm no one could stop. The first wave came just after sunrise. Armed white men began marching north, crossing the railroad tracks that separated white Tulsa from the black district. Some wore stolen uniforms, others carried rifles looted from hardware stores. They moved in small groups at first, shooting at any black resident who appeared on the street. Windows shattered, doors splintered. The sound of breaking glass echoed like a drumbeat of terror. Greenwood's men tried to fight back. Veterans who had served in France and Belgium positioned themselves along rooftops and alleyways. They knew how to shoot, how to defend. For a few brief hours, they pushed the mobs back, defending their homes with every bullet they had. But they were outnumbered, terribly outnumbered. Hundreds became thousands. White mobs advanced in every direction, setting fire to anything that stood in their path. By mid-morning, the flames began to spread. Wooden houses caught first, then stores, then churches. A line of smoke rose into the sky, black and thick, visible for miles. The sun turned red through the haze. Women screamed as they fled with children in their arms. Elderly men who could not run were dragged from their homes, beaten or shot where they stood. Rumors began to swirl that airplanes were flying overhead. Witnesses later described small private planes circling above Greenwood, dropping incendiary devices, firing rifles from the air. Some thought they were reconnaissance planes. Others swore they saw bombs fall. Whatever their purpose, the effect was devastating. Entire blocks ignited at once, flames leaping from rooftop to rooftop. Tulsa had become a battlefield, and the sky itself seemed to be on fire. The white mob swept through the streets, looting before burning. Jewelry stores, barbershops, tailors, and cafes were stripped bare. Pianos were dragged into the road and smashed. Men carried furniture, trunks, and clothing out of homes that would be ash within the hour. The Stratford Hotel, once a monument to black achievement, was torched. The Dreamland Theatre, a symbol of pride and joy, burned to the ground. Some white men wore badges, deputized by local authorities and given permission to protect property. In reality, they joined in the destruction. Reports later showed that Tulsa police officers handed out weapons to white civilians and arrested black residents who tried to defend themselves. The National Guard was eventually called in, but instead of disarming the white mob, guardsmen rounded up hundreds of black men at gunpoint and marched them to internment camps. Greenwood's defenders, stripped of their weapons, watched helplessly as their homes vanished in fire. By noon, the heart of Black Wall Street was gone. The heat was unbearable. Gasoline fumes hung in the air. Bodies lay in the streets, men, women, children. Some died trying to protect their families, others simply caught in the chaos. Those who survived fled into the countryside, hiding in fields and creek beds as the city behind them burned. In less than 24 hours, 35 city blocks were reduced to ashes. Nearly 10,000 black residents were left homeless. The official death toll would later claim around 30 people, but eyewitnesses knew the truth. It was far higher, perhaps hundreds. The bodies of many victims were never recovered, their graves unmarked, their stories silenced for decades. By nightfall, the flames began to die, leaving only smoke and silence. The proud, thriving Greenwood district, the jewel of black enterprise, was gone. Where laughter, jazz and commerce had filled the air just one day before, now stood a wasteland of smoldering ruins. As darkness fell over the charred remains of the city, the survivors gathered what little they had. Mothers searched for their children among the ashes. Fathers stared at the horizon, their faces hollow, trying to understand how everything they had built could vanish so quickly. Tulsa's night of fire was over, but its wound would not heal. The smoke still rose, curling into the black sky, carrying with it the voices of those who had believed in a better America, voices that would not be heard again for generations. When the flames finally burned themselves out, Tulsa lay in ruins. The Greenwood district, once proud, prosperous, and alive, was now a wasteland of ashes and twisted metal. The air reeked of smoke and burned flesh. Families wandered through the ruins, barefoot and silent, searching for loved ones, for anything that had survived. Nothing remained but the shells of buildings and the ghosts of what had been. The morning after the massacre was not filled with rescue, but with humiliation. Black survivors who had escaped death were rounded up by armed guards and forced to march through the streets. Men, women, even children were herded into makeshift detention centers. The fairgrounds, the baseball park, the convention hall. They were told it was for their protection, but in truth, it was imprisonment. The same authorities who had failed to stop the mob now treated the victims as criminals. Inside those camps, thousands of people slept on the ground without blankets or food. Families were separated. Some were allowed to leave only if a white employer came to vouch for them. Mothers clung to their children, afraid they would be taken away. The cries of infants mingled with the distant sound of collapsing walls as Greenwood's last fires sputtered out. Meanwhile, city officials moved quickly, not to deliver justice, but to erase the memory of what had happened. Newspapers printed false stories, blaming black residents for starting the violence. The official death toll was minimized. Photographers were ordered to hand over their pictures, though some hid their negatives, preserving evidence for future generations. The Tulsa Tribune, whose article had sparked the lynch mob, simply pretended the editorial had never existed. The dead were quietly buried, some in mass graves, some in unmarked plots at the edge of town. For decades, no one knew how many were killed. Survivors spoke of trucks carrying bodies away at night, of train cars filled with corpses, of shallow graves dug under police supervision. The truth was buried along with them. In the weeks that followed, the people of Greenwood, those who had nothing left but each other, began to rebuild. They sifted through the rubble for bricks that could be cleaned and reused. Churches set up tents where sanctuaries had once stood. Barbers, tailors, and teachers gathered what tools they could find. They built new homes out of the debris of the old ones. It was an act of defiance, a way of saying, "We are still here." But the city of Tulsa had other plans. The white leaders proposed new fire ordinances that would make rebuilding nearly impossible. They tried to seize the land, calling the ruins unsafe, and suggesting that Greenwood should be moved farther away from downtown. Yet, despite every obstacle, the survivors refused to leave. They fought in court for the right to rebuild on their own ground, and they won. Slowly, brick by brick, Greenwood began to rise again. Still, the scars ran deep. Many who had lost everything never returned. Children who witnessed the fires carried the trauma all their lives. In homes across Tulsa, silence became a shield. Parents rarely spoke of what had happened, fearing it would bring trouble. For half a century, schools and newspapers avoided the subject. It was as if an entire city had agreed to forget. The survivors did not forget. They gathered in churches and small meetings, telling their stories in whispers. They remembered the names of neighbors who had died, the sound of airplanes above, the smell of smoke. They remembered the courage of those who had fought back, and the kindness of those who had risked their lives to hide them. By the end of 1921, Greenwood was no longer the same. The elegant hotels, the theaters, the libraries, all gone. Yet in the ashes, seeds of resilience remained. A few businesses reopened, children returned to improvised classrooms, and Sunday choirs sang again. The district that had been burned to nothing refused to vanish entirely. Tulsa's silence became its second crime. For decades, official records made no mention of the massacre. Insurance companies refused to pay claims, calling the destruction a riot. No white rioter was ever charged. No public apology was offered. The city simply moved on, as if Greenwood had never existed. But history, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of breathing again. In the broken streets and burned bricks of Greenwood, the truth waited, waiting for a generation brave enough to uncover it, to speak aloud the story Tulsa tried to erase. Decades passed, but the smoke from Greenwood never truly cleared. It lingered in the memories of those who had lived through the fire, in the silence of mothers who refused to speak of that night, in the eyes of children who grew up knowing that everything they loved had been stolen and never returned. The massacre was not just a tragedy, it was a theft of homes, wealth, pride, and history. For 50 years, Tulsa lived under a pact of silence. In white neighborhoods, the massacre was treated as a rumor, a shame best forgotten. In black homes, it was remembered in whispers, told cautiously, like a dangerous secret. The city rebuilt itself over the ashes of Greenwood, erecting new buildings and roads on ground where people had died. There were no memorials, no lessons. In schools, no public acknowledgement. The ruins of Black Wall Street were erased from maps, and the people who had built it were erased from history. Yet the survivors endured. They carried the memory like an ember, passing it quietly to their children and grandchildren. In the 1930s and 40s, a new generation grew up in the shadow of that silence, unaware that the land beneath their feet had once been one of the most prosperous black communities in America. But time has a way of unearthing what has been buried. By the 1960s, as the civil rights movement spread across the nation, voices in Tulsa began to rise again. Historians and activists started to ask questions. Old photographs resurfaced. Images of bodies lying in the streets, of buildings burning, of the Dreamland Theater reduced to rubble. People who had kept silent for decades began to speak. Elderly survivors told their stories in interviews and church meetings, their voices trembling but resolute. Then came the 1970s and 80s, and with them, a slow but growing reckoning. Black Tulsans demanded recognition and restitution. Reporters began writing about the massacre again. Each new story cracked the wall of denial that had surrounded the city for so long. The truth could no longer be contained. In 1996, 75 years after the massacre, the state of Oklahoma finally established the Tulsa Race Riot Commission to investigate what had really happened. Survivors, now in their 90s and hundreds, came forward to testify. Their stories were vivid and devastating. They spoke of airplanes dropping fire, of family members shot as they ran, of soldiers pointing rifles at their fathers. They spoke not with hatred, but with grief. The Commission's report, released in 2001, confirmed what the survivors had always known. The destruction of Greenwood was not a riot. It was a massacre, an act of racial terror. It was organized, deliberate, and aided by authorities who should have protected their citizens. The report recommended reparations for survivors and their descendants. Yet, even then, compensation never came. The city expressed regret but stopped short of justice. Still, the truth was now out in the open. Schools began to teach about Greenwood again. Documentaries were filmed, books were written, and the story that Tulsa had buried for generations was told to the world. The name Black Wall Street became a symbol of both extraordinary achievement and unimaginable loss. Today, the Greenwood district has risen again, though only fragments of the old neighborhood remain. New businesses and museums stand where the ashes once lay. The Greenwood Cultural Center tells the story of those who built, lost, and rebuilt again. The legacy of Black Wall Street now lives in the art, the music, and the activism of a new generation that refuses to let history be erased. The massacre that Tulsa once tried to forget has become impossible to ignore. It is now part of America's reckoning, a reminder of how easily progress can be destroyed by hate, and how powerful the human spirit can be in rebuilding from ruin. The survivors are nearly all gone, but their voices echo through the generations. They speak in every classroom that tells their story, in every march for justice, in every act of remembrance. Their message is clear: history denied is history repeated, and so we remember, not only the night Tulsa burned, but the dream of Greenwood and the strength of those who refused to let it die.